Welcome to Creating Presence. I'm Dr. Sandra Bloom, and I'm here with my co-host, Sarah Yanosy.
Hello, everyone.
Sarah and I have spent the last 25 years working with leaders across the United States and around the world to build trauma-informed workplaces and to transform service delivery for nonprofit, government, and for-profit organizations, particularly those that exist for the purpose of helping people. In this podcast, we're sharing our insights, our experiences, and our knowledge in the hopes of inspiring leaders and other professionals to put these ideas into practice to become trauma-informed systems.
Today, we're going to talk about vicarious trauma, what it is, how to recognize it, how to prevent it, and what to do to combat it if it's already taken hold in your organization. We'll start by giving a simple explanation of vicarious trauma, which was originally identified in the field of psychiatry when we observed, well, not we, when it was observed that psychiatrists sometimes developed symptoms that looked really similar to the ones that they were seeing in the patients they were treating. And that was happening because of their own exposure to the stories that were being shared, right? So a patient would disclose information about their own trauma, and a psychiatrist, in hearing that, would sort of take it on and then start to feel the feelings and display some of the same symptoms of PTSD or chronic stress reactions that they were seeing in their patients. But we now understand that it's not just exposure through stories. It's also from other experiences as well. Being engaged in reenactments, right, as a therapist and as a direct service provider in residential care, kind of getting drawn into one of the roles that a patient was, kind of recreating or reenacting, and, kind of being part of that relational experience can be a risk factor for vicarious trauma. Being subject to traumatic behaviors, right? So when they're acting out their behaviors, I mean, I'm thinking about, earlier in my career being kicked, hit, cursed at, and a lot of people who work in the helping fields have been on the receiving end of those behavioral reenactments. But even working in a traumatized system can be part of our experience of vicarious trauma. So, we love to talk about the biology when we explain these concepts. So let's do that, Sandy.
Well, emotions are contagious. So whenever we're in conversation with other people, we automatically and unconsciously mimic and kind of synchronize our own movements with the facial expressions and the voices and the postures and the movements and the behavior of other people, whoever we're talking to. So our emotional connection with other people means that emotions are catching, especially that we're especially likely to pick up fear and anger. Although on a good day, laughter is very contagious too. But fear and anger, because it has enormous survival value. And when we've picked up somebody else's feelings, we begin to act on those feelings. So we fall into the rhythm and we still don't even realize that that's what's happened.
And for people who are in kind of caring professions or caregiving roles, right? Parents or even children who are caring for their adult parents, but professionals specifically who are in some way in a helper role, we are especially vulnerable to emotional contagion. And that's a good thing in some ways, right? It makes us more empathic. It makes us really good at our jobs because we read people well. But it also can be a real vulnerability. And that emotional contagion is more likely to happen when we are paying close attention to other people, right? So if we are really tuned in and kind of riveted um, on other people. If we think about ourselves in terms of our interrelatedness to others, right, which is partly what good trauma-informed practice means. So good in terms of our work, but also kind of a vulnerability for emotional contagion. If we are able to read the verbal and nonverbal cues from other people really well, if we have a strong tendency to mimic facial, vocal, or posture cues, um, if we're aware of our own emotional responses, like being emotionally reactive, that makes us more likely to be in, an emotional contagion kind of state.
Exactly. And what's so important is to recognize that our logical brain, the brain we um, are so proud of and think is always running the show, it isn't.
Mhm.
Our logical brain is only about 10,000 years old. The emotional brain is millions of years old. We know so much more now about emotions, and we know that all mammals have a rich emotional life. So, in terms of evolution, emotions are critical components of our evolutionary history. So trying to pretend that we are governed by logical thought is just ridiculous. It's just silly. We are governed by our emotions. And that's why it's so important to learn how to manage our emotions and integrate our emotional experience with our logical thinking mind so that we can make logical, clear decisions.
And when we think about our evolutionary history, right, humans only survive when we are grouped up socially with other humans for protection, right? We are not so good at being on our own. And that's why we create communities. Um, but we have evolved over time this adaptation to be able to read each other's emotions, right? Behavioral cues, nonverbal cues. That's how we communicate when we can't use language. And we see this with infants, especially. They tell us everything through their behaviors and through their body language. And that's really adaptive. It's really important because when there's a danger, we need to be able to communicate that and make everybody aware of that. And we may not be able to do that verbally. And so we have to be able to do it with our bodies. And so that's persisted. We still have that, even though as adults, we have access to language.
Yeah, I have dogs, not infants. And, my older dog, who's 10, she comes up, she sits next to me, and she just stares at me, unblinking,
Yeah.
until I understand that she needs to go out. My puppy, however, jumps on me, claws me, rips something up to convey the same message. So emotions play a really vital role in our day-to-day existence. But unfortunately, that role is often minimized and denied. And what's so really problematic about that is emotions pretty much decide what we think. They prioritize thinking because they direct our attention to whatever is emotionally arousing. They're sufficiently vivid and available that they're there to be used with judgment and memory. But emotional swings change our perspective and encourage us to have multiple points of view. So emotional states are really important in being integrated into what we think. And they differentially encourage different specific problem approaches. So most importantly, emotions connect us to each other, to other people.
Yeah, uh, I'm thinking about Marco Giacoboni's work. And in 2008, he wrote Mirroring People, where he talks a lot about mirror neurons. which are these specialized cells that we have from the time that we're born that kind of create the phenomenon of repetition and imitation for us. So even newborns will mimic facial expressions, and that's because of their mirror neurons, right? They are taking in sensory information through observation of what the people around them are doing, and they will do the same thing. When we see somebody suffering in pain, mirror neurons help us read their facial expressions. And we actually can experience pain ourselves because of those mirror neurons, because we are picking up their emotions and integrating them and experiencing them, which is uncomfortable, but also really powerful and really good because it puts us in a position to be able to respond. And also really good because these mirror neurons and these moments of connection, of taking someone else's emotions and experiencing them, they're the foundation for empathy. And we think possibly even morality. And that means that morality is deeply rooted in our biology. And so that is part of how it works when we are drawn to these helping fields. Part of that is because of our mirror neurons.
Yeah, it's no coincidence that people in the population who are the most amoral, do not seem to have any moral compass, also lack the capacity for empathy. It's a brain thing, and we call those people psychopaths. Mirror neurons are what let us understand the intentions of other people. And laboratory experiments really strongly support the hypothesis that human beings understand the mental states of others by actually simulating them in our own brains. So this is a quote from Dr. Iacobani. He said, well, our brains are capable of mirroring the deepest aspects of the minds of others, even at the fine-grained level of a single cell. So research has shown that people who do not feel or express empathy, or sometimes any emotions except anger and rage, how they just lack a moral compass entirely. And they have some profound disturbance, including a lack of activation they've seen in the mirror neuron system and its related brain components.
Yeah, that research also looked at children. And what they saw was that when they were looking at brain function while children were watching other people expressing emotions, there was a strong correlation between the interpersonal competence of the child, right? So the better they were relationally, um, that was correlated with mirror neuron activity during the imitation of facial emotional expression.
And that gets to the heart of what traumatic experience does, not just to the victims, but to everyone around them. In her landmark book, which everybody should read, Judy Herman, it was called Trauma and Recovery. She said to study psychological trauma means bearing witness to horrible events. And when the traumatic events are of human design, those who bear witness are caught in the conflict between victim and perpetrator. It is morally impossible to remain neutral in this conflict. The bystander is forced to take sides.
Yeah. Well, in your first book was called Bearing Witness. And I think that, is another really powerful parallel. As people in helping fields, that's what we're signing up to do, to bear witness to other people's pain. And then, sometimes inadvertently take that on. And that's what causes vicarious trauma. But the problem that we see in the larger world is that most people don't sign up for that. And so what that means is that people who are victims of trauma and adversity, often people don't want to hear about their experiences, even if they say they do, even if they, are in relationships with victims and are, people who love them. There's a lot of research now about how hard it is for victims to be able to share their stories in a way that's validating without experiencing kind of the re-traumatizing rejection. And there's some reasons for that.
Sure. Um, and there's all kinds of ways to do it. Can be obvious, I don't want to hear about it, or can be just changing the subject. Trying to say, well, it wasn't that bad. Or ultimately just not having anything to do with the person because you don't want to hear it. And these are all forms of what are called psychological defenses.
Yeah, Sandy, I actually have an example. When I was working in early on in my career, as in my mid 20s, and I was running a program that primarily served kids who had experienced sexual abuse. And at that stage of my life, I was going to like a lot of weddings and baby showers and bridal showers and all that kind of stuff. And when you meet new people, they ask you, "Oh, what do you do for a living?" And I, would say, I work with sexually abused kids." They would be like,
Silence.
"Yeah, okay, great.
Oh, that's good.
I'm gonna go get a drink. Nice meeting you," right? And they would just like walk away. And I can't really blame them because, nobody wants to hear, what that's like. And I think there's like some fear of, what they might hear. And also weirdly, there's almost like a fear of contagion, right? Like when you are exposed to this stuff, you do take it on, and people don't want to associate with it or think about it. It's too painful.
It's just it's too much. We all develop psychological defenses a bit in our childhood, really. That's when it begins. And they are to protect us from knowing about something that is overwhelming or painful in some way. Certainly, how real and common traumatic experiences are. But when they're used too often, then it can mean that our perception of reality can become really distorted. So
Yeah,
it's kind of, I have glasses.
right.
So if I take off my glasses, things don't look nearly as clear as with my glasses on. But if I had really ripply glasses, funny lenses that were distorted, then after a while, everything would look normal, but it really wouldn't be normal at all.
I actually had this experience when I was working with this population of kids I was just describing. I think it really sort of distorted my perception about the world. Every kid I came in contact with all day long had been sexually abused. And when I had my first child and became a mom, I think it really shifted how I thought about safety out in the world. And I'm not proud of this, but I definitely was really overly protective. When he would want to go to the bathroom by himself, as an 8-year-old in a public place, and I was like, no, you're gonna come with me. I don't want you. I don't want you in there by yourself. Like I had exaggerated the risk, and that could be really debilitating for kids. But it was my vicarious trauma response. It was not about him. And so that distortion really played out for me without my awareness.
And equally dangerous is developing positive illusions that those bad things couldn't possibly happen to my child, right? So,
Right.
so how do trying to walk that balance of how to be protective, but at the same time, not have illusions that the world is a better place than it actually is. So that it's hugely difficult, I think, for people today when we're being flooded with examples of how dangerous the world is and how many victims there are and the denial of the victimization. A really good film that I recall about that is a movie called Spotlight around the sexual abuse of children and the journalists who just could not believe what this was about until they did.
Right. The
So
sexual
it's
abuse by priests, right?
Yes, exactly. So it's a hard place for parents to walk, I think, is how not to be overprotective and not to be underprotective in the world that we live in.
Yeah, and as staff members, as well as, just humans out in the world, in order to really be trauma informed, we have to have some awareness and sort of know what our own psychological defenses are so that they don't get in the way of, delivering good services.
So this notion of how we can be affected, particularly as caregivers, by the suffering and the pain of other people. It's been called a number of different things. Vicarious trauma, secondary traumatic stress, compassion fatigue, co-victimization, traumatic countertransference, contact victimization, and indirect trauma. All of those have been used over time.
And they've come from different fields, right? So
Yeah.
depending on the population that is being served, those terms kind of emerged from those experiences. But we really think about them, in many ways as kind of under the same umbrella.
Yeah, they came different times from different people, and they didn't necessarily know the other terms, so they weren't contradicting. They actually just arose in different ways. So vicarious trauma was defined originally as the cumulative transformative effect on the helper of working with survivors of traumatic life events. So both the positive and the negative transformative effects. Compassion fatigue was defined as the natural, predictable, treatable, and preventable unwanted consequence of working with suffering people. Secondary traumatic stress was defined as the natural consequent behaviors and emotions resulting from knowledge about a traumatizing event experienced by someone else, a significant other in one's life. And the symptoms can be almost identical to PTSD, except that exposure to a traumatizing event experienced by one person actually becomes a traumatizing event for another person that wasn't actually present at the time of the event.
And there are some risk factors that are evident from all of the research in these areas. One is having a past history of trauma. And we know from the ACEs study that at least 2/3 of our population in the US has a trauma history, even higher for people who are doing helping work. Overwork, which in the funding environment that we're in is kind of the standard. Poor respect for boundaries, right? So I think, what comes to mind for me is, being on call 24/7, constant exposure to stories and traumatizing content through the news, too high a caseload of trauma survivors. So I think about people who are serving veterans or, like my team, serving sexually abused kids, not having as much experience, having a high number of traumatized children, a different distinction between working with children and adults. High caseload of traumatized children is a risk factor. And then too many negative outcomes, right? Not seeing people recover in the way that you would hope or want, or seeing, the strengths or growth from your work.
And the symptoms really vary depending on the person and the circumstances, but they include a feeling like you have no time and no energy, disconnecting from other people, becoming socially withdrawn, becoming super sensitive to violence. So the things you used to like on TV, you don't watch anymore. Alterations in sensory experiences, which may include the more typical symptoms of PTSD, like being chronically hyperaroused, hypervigilant, becoming emotionally numb, avoidance, having intrusive experiences like flashbacks and nightmares, a diminished sense of being effective, having what's called a disrupted frame of reference, including disruptions in one's identity and worldview and sense of spirituality, and becoming really cynical.
Yeah, and that disruption in worldview is really, I think, another way to think about what happened for me with my son in the bathroom, right? The way that I saw the world had shifted because of my exposure. Um, and so all of these different symptoms or phenomena our listeners might recognize in themselves or in their colleagues and their coworkers. And so we want to talk a little bit more after our break about some of the impacts on our psychological needs, right? We need in order to combat this, and also think about what else we can do. So thanks for listening to Creating Presence. After the break, we'll talk more about vicarious trauma. We'll be right back after these messages.
If you want to develop a trauma-responsive culture within your organization, your leaders must be able to be knowledgeable and possess the skills to create positive change. Creating Presence, developed by world-renowned Dr. Sandra Bloom, offers an online training and coaching process that will help leaders become capable to cultivate a safe, productive, and values-aligned environment for your staff and clients. For more information, go to www.creatingpresence.net. Creating Presence is managed by Lakeside, your resource for trauma-responsive care.
Welcome back to Creating Presence. I'm Dr. Sandra Bloom, and I'm here with my co-host, Sarah Yanosy. And we're going to continue our discussion about vicarious trauma and creating wellness plans for staff as a part of Creating Presence.
Yeah, we talked in our last segment about compassion fatigue, burnout, and secondary traumatic stress, as well as vicarious trauma. And new research on the topic suggests that these are complementary terms that can affect a helper simultaneously. So it's possible for someone in a helping profession to experience one without the other. So a couple examples. If there's a nurse who's working in a long-term care facility and, the nurse doesn't have a lot of trauma exposure, she or he may not experience any secondary traumatic stress or vicarious trauma, but may feel a lot of compassion fatigue. A police officer who has a really healthy work environment, but has a lot of trauma exposure. So if she's investigating child pornography, for example, she might have real low levels of burnout and compassion fatigue because there's not a lot of victim contact, but may be struggling with really high levels of vicarious and secondary trauma.
Right. And then there are all the organizational risk factors for any or all of these problems, like a macho culture where the norm is that people suppress their emotions and they don't talk about emotions. The absence of willingness to talk and to process negative experiences, providing no respite for staff, just that, 24/7, you're working way too many hours, no opportunities. You can relate to this, huh?
Oh, I was going to say too, in a lot of the systems that I'm working with and coaching for creating presence, staff members have to work extra shifts, overtime. Sometimes it's mandated, sometimes it's not mandated, but it's the only way they can survive financially. So, like, that sets people up for enormous amounts of exposure.
And it's so different than in other countries where the funding is much more generous for human services. Um, Having no opportunities to learn new things for continuing education, not having enough vacation time so you can really get away from all of it, having no time or willingness to really process grief and loss. An environment where there is a pervasive denial of how common exposure to trauma actually is in the population. So not just in human services with the clients, but in the staff.
I
Having a,
think oh,
yeah, go
sorry,
ahead.
Sandy, but I think in particular, we see this in the justice system. Like, there is a real orientation to accountability, which, is important, but not a lot of recognition of, the experiences of trauma for both people who are incarcerated and how traumatizing the system itself is, and the same for the people who work in it.
Yeah, I have a number of colleagues who are working uphill, who are in the justice system trying to change that because the pervasiveness of trauma is just everywhere when it comes to issues of people in the justice system. And that's related to, the punitive environments that occur. Like somehow we can punish our way out of all these problems, which is just absurd. A loss of group cohesion and a breakdown of community that occurs when everybody is really struggling with everything we're describing. The failure to respond for leaders to respond to what are obvious signs that people are really having a difficulty, not really knowing what people are doing and what they're experiencing. Uh, Trauma is characterized by helplessness. So if you're in an organization where you don't really have a control over any of this, you're more likely to get burned out. Insufficient reward and often an absence of equity, of fairness, conflicting values. So many people are in situations where they have to try to make profit for the organization they're in, but that is a direct conflict for them with their belief that they are in the job in order to help people.
Mhm.
And a failure to capture what really works, what is successful, and failure to identify all this, a failure to really reckon with the issue of secondary trauma, vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, and burnout, what it all means.
Yeah, and if it goes on for too long, these symptoms sort of persisting and the exposure persisting, then people are at risk for burnout. And what that looks like is emotional exhaustion, cynicism, and a loss of efficacy, or at the very least, feeling powerful or feeling empowered. It's a collection of symptoms, rather than a fixed condition, right? So it's not like a thing that you have. And it happens gradually and gets progressively worse. So it's, I think, really important to know what the signs are. It starts with gradual exposure to job strain. So it's kind of that external factor of like what you're experiencing. And that gets more and more intense. And then there's an erosion of idealism, right? And I think that cynicism is so common in our field. For that reason, we kind of come in excited and wanting to help, and over time, that exuberance just really fades. And then there's a void of achievement, right? So we don't see success. And it feels like we're just kind of spinning our wheels. And that's really where we start to see that burnout manifesting.
Yeah, and if you're a manager, you better watch out for these negative signs that you've got a widespread problem with burnout. People just not showing up, absenteeism, high job turnover, which is a huge problem in medical, mental health, and social services. Low productivity. People are unhappy with their job. They're not committed to it. Quiet quitting, that whole issue of quiet quitting is about this. And then all kinds of home life problems that are a secondary result of what's happening at the job, and lots of physical problems that are really secondary to being burned out. And there are lots of risk factors. So some people are more at risk for this than others. Those who have a past adversity, and we referred to this earlier, of a past history of exposure to adversity, which, as Sarah pointed out, is the majority of the population. So we're not talking about a small segment of people here, where there is a poor respect for boundaries. They don't know how to have healthy interpersonal boundaries. And where there's constant exposure to trauma survivors. Those are all personal risk factors. Professional risk factors are not being able to differentiate between interpersonal conflicts and what are actually task-related conflicts. Power imbalances in what should be partnerships. And that what I was referring to earlier, that pressure to prioritize funding over health or integrity of any sort is takes a huge toll on people.
But there are some protective factors, and the biggest, most significant is social support. And so in creating presence, our whole process of implementation is about generating social support among and between staff and leaders. So that is really something important to highlight. Just knowing about vicarious trauma is protective, being able to recognize if it's happening and identify it earlier on. Opportunities to talk with colleagues and have relationships. Also, going to therapy. We're therapists, so we definitely see the value in that inherently, but really thinking about this as a way of protecting against vicarious trauma, I think it is worth noting too. Being connected to a bigger purpose. So seeing, like for me, for example, I really think about my work as a calling. And some days are better than others in how well I'm able to meet my personal mission. But that's really helpful as well, kind of that seeing this as having a bigger purpose. Being committed to our own wellness, and we'll talk more in detail about what that means. Using an emotional volume plan, which we've covered in a previous podcast, like being able to regulate and moderate our own emotions. And then having communication strategies, having, again, like these last few pieces are so much about the skills that we're teaching in creating presence. Managing conflict, being able to address microaggressions or those interpersonal conflicts that happen at work, really helpful and protective, partly because most people report that they're dissatisfaction or burnout is not so much related to their work with the people they're serving. It's more about their relationship with their direct supervisor or their relationship with their colleagues and coworkers, and the kind of unpleasant stuff that unfolds in that part of the work.
Yeah, I don't know about you, but my first experience of I think probably secondary, no, yeah, maybe. It's hard to say. I think secondary traumatic stress was I was a teenager and I was working in the as a candy striper in the recovery room. I mean, in the emergency room, and a young child, toddler, was brought in who had been deliberately immersed in boiling water, and uh, that was at that time, and probably ever since, the worst thing I've ever seen. And
Mm.
I've never got that out of my head, and I think it made me um, not deny the reality of child abuse as I have gone through my career. And then the issues of um, secondary and vicarious trauma really, from that point on, didn't actually come from my patients.
Mm.
It was actually a result of what was going on at a higher level over which I had no control. So I couldn't adequately protect my program from decisions that were being made that there was nothing I could do about. And those were terrible events for me because I was parenting this program and I couldn't
Yeah.
I couldn't protect it. What about
Yeah.
you?
I think about when I came back to work after maternity leave when Jonah, my oldest, was born. And on my first day back, I was working in the program that I was describing earlier, and there were twins who were admitted, and they had been adopted from an Eastern European country by a family in the United States. And they had been adopted when they were about 2 years old. And they had lived for the first 2 years of their lives in an orphanage. And it was clear that they had reactive attachment disorder. They had been neglected, and their symptoms were really intense. Just, I don't want to distress people by sharing details, but it was dangerous for them to be in the home that they were in because of what they were doing to the other kids and other family members. And they were 6 at the time. And so over the course of working with them and this family, the adoptive family had shared that their intention was to rehome them. And I had experienced disrupted adoptions for most of my career. I mean, I'd been working in the field for a long time at that point. And, terminations of parental rights and disrupted adoptions were not unfamiliar to me. But when I came back after the birth of my child, and I was different, I was a mom now, and this just hit differently. And I remember thinking, like I had these really intense, overwhelming emotions, and some really unusual thoughts for me. I was like, I'm going to need to adopt them. I am going to take them home. And yes, that's a perfect idea because I live in a 1-bedroom apartment in New York City with my wife and our newborn baby, and exactly what we need are, more children with serious mental health problems and to complement, our 2 cats and, and so much space. Right. So that was not realistic at all. And, grossly, uh, you know, inconsistent with my boundaries. So that was a good, recognition for me that this was a vicarious trauma reaction. Then I shifted gears completely and started to think, and I think you might remember this, Sandy. I was like, I think I'm going to go to nursing school. I want to be a midwife and I want to catch babies. That's not what midwives do, number one. And I know that. But I had this fantasy that like I was just going to be, having this delightful experience of catching babies when they came out. So again, like my thinking was so distorted. And I was really lucky. I had people around me, including you, who were really helpful in pointing out these distortions in my thinking and the way that I was making meaning of what was happening. I'm really happy to report, one, I stayed in the field. Two, I was able to kind of do my own work with that support and help this family who did end up rehoming their children. And I ran into the mom in a grocery store a few years after that. And she waited for me outside. And when I came outside, she said, I just wanted to tell you that the twins are doing great in their new home. We go down to visit them twice a year and we maintain contact and we're close with their new family. And we're really grateful for your support and your team's support in helping make this transition. And that almost never happens. So I feel like that was also a real vicarious trauma protection moment because, when you're doing something that feels kind of counterintuitive to what the purpose of the work is, right? Family reunification, family preservation, that feels risky too. So that's some kind of been my experience with vicarious trauma.
Well, I think, all of this that we've experienced kind of illustrates why we thought it was so important in creating presence to have everyone do what we call a wellness plan. And the purpose is for each person to define actions that help them to cope with whatever stressors they encounter on the job. Because it's not just direct service, all the indirect service workers, or think about in the justice system, think about the court recorders or the IT people who are taking down all the information, or the photographers photographing crime scenes. I mean, we're talking here about everybody, not just people who are providing direct care. It means promoting awareness of the health risks of stress and promoting expectations that everybody has to individually take responsibility for their own wellness.
Yeah, when we help people construct a wellness plan, we look at 5 different categories, but we really want to emphasize that you don't have to do something in all 5, right? It may be that one category or 2 at any given time might be what's most needed and most effective in focusing on your wellness. So there are a couple of different ways that we, suggest people work on this wellness plan. One is to think about it from their personal perspective, like what can you do when you're not at work to engage in wellness practices, and what can you do when you are at work? So, for example, in the category of physical wellness, right? Some people might say, they're going to work out 3 times a week. I would never do that. For me, I eat salad once a week. Like, that's as far as I can commit. But work-specific physical examples might be things like taking breaks during the day. If you can, doing movement or stretching. Looking at how your office space is set up for your health, like just making sure you have water at your desk or near your desk. If you have to do any kind of, physical, medical stuff. I'm thinking about like medication or injections or even pumping for breastfeeding, finding a space to do that, to be able to take care of your physical needs.
And then there's your social needs, right? And what keeps you well socially. Meeting with friends for a book club once a month might be an example. There are work-specific ways of developing your social wellness plan. So thinking about, and at a management level, really thinking about this for your staff, personal days, flex time, where people can get away when they need to. A go dark practice when you leave work, like you're not expected to check messages or emails. You're not allowed to do it until the next morning when you're at work. Scheduling difficult tasks interspersed with not so difficult things, or quiet, simpler tasks, taking brain breaks throughout the day, identifying projects and tasks that actually make you really excited and hopeful, creating a plan for how you're going to learn more, what further training are you going to need, developing and implementing a schedule for regular supervision or consultation, maybe finding a mentor or partnering with somebody that you look up to learn more from, to get more support. Simple things like just being grateful to somebody, bringing in donuts and coffee, leave notes, leave silly cartoons in the break room, and dedicating enough time to go to workshops and conferences and refresh yourself and your workspace.
Yeah. I actually, this is refreshing my workspace, reorganizing my workspace. That is like number one on my, my wellness plan in this category. I move the pictures around on my walls periodically. I like to go through my desk drawers and clear out anything, that I don't need anymore. Like, for me, that just creates a sense of control in a very chaotic, out of control environment. I have no idea what's going to happen when a patient walks into my office, but I know where my pencils are, and that helps a lot. Another category is sort of this combined category of community and relationships. So, kind of creating connections, and one of the things that, might fall under the community example, right? Because we want to be connected to, not, our work is not our whole life. And so I think about, volunteering at my kids' school once a year, and I have failed at that. So instead, I make part of my, my practice of wellness around community, like being part of my community, is I donate their outgrown clothing, and that really, that feels really good for me, and I feel like I'm contributing something. With relationships, and it could be like having a family dinner a certain number of times a week, or just committing to hugging your loved ones. For work, some of the things might be identifying people that you can ask for help, or scheduling a time to think about and share successes.
And then the final category is what we call spiritual, right? Whatever that means for the person. Might be going to church, it might not. Might be meditating, it might be seeking connections, it might be the people you serve, the language you use, your own identity, or what you do within your organization, but how you define that. But it's that higher meaning, kind of purposeful part of us that's so essential.
Yeah, so we want to encourage you to think about your own wellness plan. And thanks so much for listening to Creating Presence. Join us next week when Sandy and I will talk more about what it means to lead in a trauma-informed organization. You can reach us at creatingpresence.net or voiceamerica.com. See you next week.